This is my Honda XR150L, the cheapest, smallest, and by far slowest dual sport that Honda offers on the market today.
And today, I'm taking its power to the next level using this secret part.
You see, I think I have a problem. I bought this bike because it was cheap and reliable. And ever since then, I've been sinking more and more money into it, modifying it piece by piece in what seems like a never-ending pursuit for more power. And in this video, the culmination of all the money, modifications, and effort will be revealed, as I'll be installing the final parts necessary to make this bike into a monster. But it won't be easy.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we have a problem. Now, my XR has already gone through multiple stages. Stage 1 was installing a high-flow aftermarket exhaust and a larger carburetor. Stage 2 consisted of slapping on a big bore kit, a racing camshaft, and an upgraded CDI. But now we're moving on to stage 3. And in order to take full advantage of the modifications that have already been done to this bike and make even more power, we're gonna need help from the components in this box.
And when I say this is a secret part, I kind of mean it. These parts aren't something you can buy from any of the typical trusted motorcycle websites within the United States, because that would be too easy, right? We had to look into the country of Indonesia, where there's a company named Bintang Race Team that develops a bunch of high-performance parts for bikes just like the XR. And luckily for us in the US, there's a company called SXParts that sells them on their website.
The reason why these are so important on 4-strokes is because the cylinder head contains the intake port, the exhaust port, and the valves. When you start messing with 4-stroke motors like this, the head really becomes a bottleneck because the intake and the exhaust ports are gonna be too small and the valves are gonna be too small. So what an aftermarket head like this allows you to do is run larger valves. That way every stroke of the motor is more efficient, it pulls in more air on the intake, it pushes out more exhaust gases on the exhaust stroke. Kind of a necessity if you want to take full advantage of the big bore kit that has been installed here. With that being said, it's kind of a process to swap this out. So we're gonna start by disassembling the bike and getting access to everything that we need.
And we've got a lot of new parts to install, so just like every good build, let's start by tearing it down. First, by removing the seat and the tank. With the seat and tank removed, next up is the exhaust and carburetor. As I mentioned before, the head on 4-stroke bikes is where all the air flows through the engine. First through the carburetor and into the intake port, and then out of the exhaust port and through the exhaust. So as these connect directly to the head, they obviously need to be removed. And just like that, we can now see the intake and exhaust port on our OEM head. But there's still a couple things like the motor mounts that gotta go. The valve cover could then be removed to expose the camshaft and the valves.
Public service announcement: before you take anything apart on the top end of a 4-stroke, make sure you set it to top dead center. You can tell it's at top dead center by the little mark in this sight hole here. You line it up, leave it there, and then you can take everything off, and when you put it back together, it'll be good to go.
And with the engine now at top dead center, I could remove the cam gear and the timing chain. And of course, taking the chain off is a lot easier if you remove the cam chain tensioner. I always put a zip tie through the cam chain just to avoid it dropping into the bottom end of the engine. And with that done, I could begin to remove the cam and the cam housing. And there was 2 final bolts before I could take the head off of the engine. And with a few gentle taps, the OEM head was removed. Now that we have the OEM head on the bench, I can remove the intake and start to compare the valves and the port sizes. I'm pretty sure the stock valves are 24 and 26 millimeters, while the aftermarket head has a 29 and 34 millimeter valve.
But before we go any farther in the build, I want to take a quick moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Gricel, and their 2400 watt portable power station. I love the outdoors, dirt bikes, road trips, camping, and that's exactly what Gricel's power stations are designed for. I recently went on a road trip to Maine with some friends, which involved thousands of miles of driving, long days hiking, and camping out in the woods, and this 2400 watt power station was with us the whole time. No joke, we had 5 people using this thing non-stop day and night, charging phones, camera batteries, lights, anything you can think of. And it lasted an entire 4 days before even needing a charge. And when it did, I could plug it straight into the truck while we were driving so we could charge it up on the move. This thing has plenty of standard power outlets. It has USB and USB-C outlets, and even a built-in LED light on the back for those late nights off the grid. And Gricel also sells solar charging kits for their power stations, which I can see coming in a lot of handy. But if worse comes to worse, you can just plug this thing into a standard wall outlet and it charges from 0 to 100 in 2 hours, which is pretty crazy. So if you want to learn more about this 2400 watt power station or any of the other products that Gricel sells, the link is in the top of the description. Thanks to Gricel for sponsoring this video, and I really appreciate when you guys support the people that support the channel. Now let's get back to the video. So I got the head off and the piston is exposed, but unfortunately this OEM piston doesn't have enough clearance for the big valves, so I actually need to remove the entire cylinder and swap the piston. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now.
And although it's unfortunate that I need to swap the piston to fit the new head, it really makes sense. The current 70mm piston was designed to work with the stock head, and the aftermarket one we're installing is a lot bigger. The intake valve on the stock head was 26mm, and on the aftermarket head, it's 34mm, 8mm larger, which is a 30.8% increase in the intake valve size. And the exhaust valve is going from 24 to 29mm, a 20.8% increase. So it's safe to say that this engine is going to be pushing a lot more air through it. Now before we install the new piston, we need to set the ring gaps. This is something that you should do every time you install a new piston and rings. To do this, you put each ring into the cylinder using the piston to make sure it's level, and then you use feeler gauges to check the gap. The correct gap depends on the type of ring and the type of motor, so I normally look up this information online. And if you need to make the gap larger, you simply use a small file to file down the ring and open it up. Once they're all gapped, you can then install them on the piston, making sure to clock them all in the correct direction, something that I would definitely once again reference the internet for. And with the piston ready, we can move back to the bike and get it installed.
Scariest part of any piston install right here, trying to get the circlip in. Gotta do it without it flying across the room. Got it.
Now that the piston is successfully installed, we can go ahead with the new gaskets and put the cylinder back on.
We got the new piston installed. This thing looks pretty mean, I can't lie. I'm pretty sure this piston is gonna up the compression ratio a little bit, so maybe that alone is gonna give us a little bit more power. Now before we install the new head, I'm gonna do a couple things. I wanna clean up a couple burrs here and there, and then install the valves, and we can get it on the bike.
Now I gotta shout out Indonesia and Bintang Race Team for creating this big valve head, but just like most cylinders or pistons, I wanted to check to make sure that there was no burrs or any metal that would interfere when I got this thing installed. And the last thing that I had to address were these two threaded ports. This head is actually designed for a CRF 150, which comes stock with ports for a crankcase pressure gauge and an O2 sensor. But being that the XR is super bare bones technology-wise, Otherwise, I don't need either of those sensors, so I need to make some plugs to plug up these ports. And with the correct bolts cut to size, I used some blue Loctite to make sure the seal was strong and threaded them in. And now it was time to install another part that I have never done before, the new valves. Now apparently, using valve grinding compound is really important when installing new valves into a head. I never knew that this was a thing until now, but you basically apply the compound directly to the valve to the part that seals against the valve seat. You then put the valve into the head and use friction back and forth, which over time ensures that the valve and the seat are a perfect match and make a tight seal. Now this process is really important because if the valve doesn't seal perfectly, you'll likely lose compression and the engine will not run as good as it should. With the head all cleaned, these parts were looking real nice, and it was time to get the valves finally installed. But before I could, I had to run to Harbor Freight and pick up this valve spring compressor. Now the valve installation itself consists of a rubber seal, the valve, a washer, the spring, and then the collar that hold it all together. And this is where the valve spring compressor comes in handy. Another specialty tool added to the collection. I'm a firm believer that if you need a tool, you should just go buy it and put it in your toolbox, because if you're working on bikes, having the right tools around when you need them makes every job 10 times easier. So I went ahead and repeated the process with the second valve and got the head all ready for installation. And just like that, the new gasket was in place and the upgraded big valve head was getting installed. With everything back together, I turned over the engine a couple times to make sure there was no weird sounds and torqued all the bolts. And I was definitely sure to not forget to set the valve clearances.
All right, guys, I do believe that I got everything situated here on the new head. The cam chain and tensioner are back in. The valves have been set to the proper clearance. We can go ahead and throw on this valve cover now, and everything else should be good to go. Not gonna lie, it's the first time I ever did anything like this, so I'm just hoping it doesn't make any weird sounds when I start it back up, but I guess we'll figure it out, huh?
The hardest part of the build is done, and the new head is installed and looking better than ever. And as the OEM head looked on from the shelf of parts that once were, we had to figure out the fueling system, starting with a new iridium spark plug to hopefully deliver a stronger, more consistent spark. And as the intake port is now 30% larger, I had to install this bigger aftermarket intake as well as a rubber boot to fit the new and improved 30mm carburetor. And for this carburetor upgrade, Nibbi Racing is back again showing support by sending me this 30mm PWK. In stock form, the XR came with a 22mm carburetor. Since then, I've tried a 26, a 28, and now a 30mm carburetor. You know, it turns out that the more performance modifications you do, the more airflow and fuel the bike needs. So I think this 30mm PWK will be perfect. And Nibbi also sent out a new throttle cable that matches up with the new carb. And as we just swapped to a brand new piston, I figured it was a perfect time to change the oil and make sure it was as fresh as possible. Now we're getting close to riding this thing and I'm getting excited, so we're gonna go ahead and throw the exhaust back on and get this thing ready to go. But before we can do that, I realized that the exhaust studs did not come in the aftermarket head, so we had to steal the ones from the OEM one. But luckily, the swap was as easy as you think it would be, and I used some anti-seize lubricant to make sure that they wouldn't get stuck. And with that done, the exhaust could then be bolted on.
I'm gonna kick it over a few times just to make sure there's no weird sounds, and then we'll go for a startup. See how this goes. Definitely feels like it has more compression.
Upon the initial startup, my nerves were definitely high. The new valves were definitely ticking louder than stock, but all things considered, the bike was running good.
That was the easiest startup it's ever had. Seems like it runs good, but it definitely sounds a little bit like ticky in the top end. So I might just double check the valves, make sure everything's good there, and then take it for a ride.
Now I was definitely concerned by the ticking top end noise, and I didn't just double check the valves. I triple checked, quadruple checked, and even checked a 5th time. And by doing this, I was able to ease my mind and ensure that the valves were absolutely perfect. But I didn't realize I was creating a much bigger problem.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but guys, we got a problem. So we got everything installed, right? The new piston is in, the upgraded head is on, engine's back together, and it starts up fine. I'm thinking everything's good. But as the motor ran, I started to notice a bit of an oil leak from the valve cover here. And that's because when I reinstalled it, I accidentally stripped out the threads from one of the bolt holes for the front bolt here, and I couldn't torque it to the right spec. And surprisingly, I'm not the first person that I've heard of do this. I actually know 2 other people that stripped out a similar bolt on their bike when they were working on the top end like this. So I think that's just something that Honda kind of dropped the ball on this XR motor. They really used too small of a thread for this valve cover, so a lot of people are stripping it out. So if you're gonna do something like this, be careful, be mindful of that. Don't torque it down too tight. So I had to go grab this M6x1 thread repair kit, and before I get to rip on this thing and finally see it in its final form, I'm gonna need to fix these threads so we're not leaking oil everywhere.
All things considered, this is a pretty minor issue compared to what could have happened when you're messing with the top end like this, but it does mean that we need to tear apart this top end again and take out the entire camshaft assembly, as that's where those broken threads are located. So with the engine back at top dead center, I went ahead and did just that. And here you can see the cam assembly with those holes that the valve cover screws screw into, and one is clearly messed up. I'm not sure why Honda decided to make this M6x1, as that's a pretty fine thread for an important bolt like this, but it is what it is. So I went ahead and got an M6x1 thread repair kit, and we went to town. Now I'm going to be fixing these threads using a helicoil, which basically requires you to drill out the hole to the next size up and tap it for 1 thread size larger than it should be. And with the hole tapped, you can then use the specialty tool and some Loctite to thread in the new insert, which fits into the larger threads on the outside and has the original M6x1 size on the inside. You can then punch out the middle, and it should be good to fit your M6x1 bolt. But before we reinstall this, I was sure to get rid of all the metal shavings. And just like that, the threads are restored, and we can put the camshaft back into the bike. I I was definitely hesitant to get the valve cover back on and tightened down, but luckily it all got put back together with no issues. And I was able to tighten it down enough to stop any oil from leaking out.
All right, people, let's try this again.
This time around, the nerves were still high, but I was confident that the valves were set properly. So I let the bike warm up and made some adjustments to the carburetor. And although the bike was running really good, I still had some concerns about heat, so I let it fully warm up and checked the head temperature with an infrared thermometer.
All right, people, the XR is back together, and honestly, it's ready to go. I think the only problem that we have left is just myself, my confidence in this thing. Having taken the entire top end apart and messed with the valves and put a new head with bigger valves and different springs and all that stuff in this motor, I'm a little bit scared to take this thing out on the street. And I definitely want to take every precaution possible. It actually runs pretty good and it sounds a lot meaner than it did before, but I will say these upgraded valves are a little bit noisier than the stock ones. And from what I've looked up, that's kind of to be expected when you're running aftermarket valves with stiffer springs that are made for more performance. In general, that makes the valves louder. So I'm hoping that that's just how upgraded valves are, because I've checked the valve clearances like 5 times actually, just to make sure that everything is as it should be. And it definitely is. So if something happens, I'm hoping it's not because of the valve clearances, it's just because maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm not that good of a motor builder. So I'm really hoping that we can break this thing in properly and nothing catastrophic happens, but if it does, at least I know that the valves were set properly. So the last thing I want to do before riding this, just for the peace of mind, is to install this temperature gauge here, because when you're running aftermarket components, you're getting more airflow, more combustion, and the temperatures of the motor are probably going to be higher than stock. So I want to use this Trail Tech gauge to mount somewhere where I can see it and constantly monitor the temperature of the motor while we're riding, just in case it gets too high. I'll know it and I'll be able to shut it down before anything crazy happens.
Trail Tech makes these temp gauges that are really easy to install, and I think I have them on 3 of my bikes. It's just peace of mind to be able to monitor the temperature of your engine while you're riding, especially when it's modified and you're not so sure about how it's running. The way that these work is you take the crush washer that comes stock on the spark plug and cut it off, because it's going to be replaced by a copper washer that's connected to the wire for the temp gauge. Once the copper washer and spark plug are in place, you can torque down the spark plug and start to route the cable for the temp gauge to where you want it. I typically route the temp gauge wire along the same route as the spark plug boot and just use zip ties to hold it in place. With the wire routed, you can then connect it to the temp gauge itself and zip tie that down for a secure connection somewhere where you can read the gauge. And without further ado, it was finally time to ride the bike.
XR 222 with the big valve head. We got the temp gauge on here. We've been running solid temps. I've been running this thing in, going through some heat cycles and just putting some miles on it. And really the temps are sitting around like 300 to 330 on average. I think our highest temp we've seen is 342. So the temps are looking good. Everything's holding together so far and we're breaking her in. I think it's time that we find a nice little spot for a 0 to 60, because I'm telling you, you can tell that the big bore kit was really being strangled by that stock head, because with this thing on there, I swear the bike is like, it's a good bit louder and you can just feel it pull so much harder through every gear. So we're gonna find a spot, do a 0 to 60 and compare that to our old numbers before we did this mod.
Now the last time we tested this bike's 0 to 60 time, every single modification was the same, except now we went to a big valve head and upgraded from a 28 to 30 millimeter carb.
60.
So it looks like 24.06 seconds is the time to beat.
Find a little spot here. Gonna do a 0 to 60, high flow, big valve head, 70 millimeter piston. Here we go. Oh my
14.15 seconds, a new best 0 to 60 time for this bike by far, trimming an entire 10 seconds off the previous best time. And I think it's safe to say that the mods in this video unlocked a new level of power. And let's not forget that when this bike was stock, you had to hit a pretty steep downhill to reach 60 miles an hour. Otherwise, it would take over 50 seconds.
58, 59, 60. That was baseline 0 to 60. Man, that's what I'm saying. Like, before with just a big bore kit, you could tell all the torque gains were from low to mid RPMs, and then above that, like, it didn't really feel like I was getting that much gain. With this high flow head, the bigger valve, from mid RPMs and up, it gets a whole new boost of power there. You still get that torque in the low RPMs, but it doesn't die out. It hits mid RPMs and high, and it just gets more and more and more, and it pulls all the way through the gear. Way more well-rounded. The motor pulls all the way through the rev range. Man, this big bore definitely wanted more air, and this thing gave it to it. So, oh man, that's awesome. Seems to be running good. No major issues so far. You know, I got nothing but raving reviews. This thing is freaking sick. And the 30mm carburetor, man, it's running better than ever. Like, it idles better, it takes off better, full throttles better. It's feeling good, man. That was straight power. Oh, dude, they would have never done that before. Okay. It has way more power. I really want to get this thing on a dyno because... Woo! Oh, it pulls. 60. Wow. Wow. Oh, let's go. It feels so good. Let me tell you, it is way louder. You can tell that motor's got way more air flowing through it because it's seriously, it sounds like it got like 30% louder just from upgrading that head. That's crazy. Man, this bike is freaking awesome though. It's so fun to ride, and it's so comfortable too. That's the crazy part about it. It's one of the most comfortable bikes I've ever ridden. It's got such a cushiony seat, and the seat is like wider than most dirt bikes, so it really just nestles you right in like a comfy couch, but it's still super nimble, super fun, and the power, oh my god, this thing is getting better and better, let me tell you what.